The invitation arrived on a Tuesday, tucked between a phone bill and a flyer for a pizza place that had already closed down. Marcus kept the mail on the kitchen counter for 2 days before he touched it. Not because he was afraid. More because he recognized the handwriting on the envelope, that careful, looping cursive that used to sign birthday cards and grocery lists, and the note she left on his pillow the morning she walked out. He stood there with his coffee going cold, staring at the cream-colored envelope like it might explain itself if he waited long enough. His daughter came padding in from the hallway, socks on the linoleum, hair still tangled from sleep. Nadia was 6 years old and had her father's dark eyes and her late aunt's stubborn jaw, and she climbed onto the kitchen stool and helped herself to a banana without asking, which was exactly what Marcus would have done at her age. "Who's that from?" she asked, pointing with the banana. "Nobody," Marcus said, and poured the cold coffee down the sink. He opened it that night after Nadia was asleep and the apartment was quiet enough that he could hear the streetcar on Queen Street 3 floors below. The card inside was heavy stock, printed in gold ink. "Corinna Ashdale and Preston Vane request the honor of your presence." He read it once. Then he set it face down on the coffee table and sat there for a long time watching the ceiling. He had met Corinna 8 years ago at a fundraising dinner for the Toronto Children's Aid Society, where he was volunteering and she was attending on her father's corporate account. He'd been 29, still working his way up through the ranks at a mid-sized infrastructure firm, the kind of job that sounded respectable at dinner parties but didn't leave much room for anything resembling comfort. She'd been 26, beautiful in a way that made him feel slightly underdressed, and she'd laughed at something he said about the canapes, and that had been enough. They were together for 4 years. He has thought about those years many times since, turning them over the way you'd turn a smooth stone in your palm, trying to find the crack that was always there underneath. He remembers the early part clearly. The way she used to text him photos of buildings she liked, because she knew he'd care about the architecture. The way she'd fall asleep on his couch, watching documentaries about the ocean. The way she once drove 40 minutes in a January snowstorm, because he had the flu and she'd decided he needed soup. He remembers thinking at a certain point that this was just what his life was now, that he'd gotten lucky. He also remembers the shift. It wasn't dramatic. It was gradual, the way a house settles. Small things at first, a comment about the neighborhood they lived in and how it wasn't quite where she'd imagined herself. A joke, said lightly, about his friends from university still driving the same cars they'd had since graduation. A hesitation before she introduced him to her colleague at a work event, a half-second pause that he filed away and tried to forget. Then his father had a stroke. Marcus took family leave, moved temporarily into his parents' house in Hamilton to help his mother manage care, drove back to Toronto on weekends. The promotion he'd been working toward for 2 years was quietly given to someone else. His savings took a hit. He was tired in a way that lived in his bones, and he knows now that he wasn't easy to be around during that period. Corinna waited 7 months before she told him she needed someone who was more present, that she'd been doing a lot of thinking, that she hoped he understood. He hadn't, really, not right away. He found out 3 months later, through a mutual acquaintance who thought he already knew, that she'd been seeing Preston Vane since before the conversation on his couch. Preston, whose father owned a real estate development company with projects in 4 provinces. Preston, who wore the right watch and summered in the right places, and had never, as far as Marcus could tell, been inconvenienced by the life of a person he loved. Marcus didn't say anything about it to anyone. He went back to work. He called his mother every other day. He ate whatever was convenient, and he ran 4 mornings a week along the waterfront, and he kept moving forward in the way you do when the alternative isn't something you can afford. And then, about a year after Corinna left, his sister called him from Vancouver and told him she'd been diagnosed with an aggressive form of ovarian cancer. She was 32. She had a daughter. Her husband had left 2 years prior, something that still made Marcus's jaw tighten every time he thought about it, and she was effectively alone. Marcus flew out. He helped her through 2 rounds of chemotherapy. He flew home, he flew back, he took more leave. He burned through what was left of his savings, and then he sold the road bike he'd had since his 20s, and he didn't think twice about it. Claire died on a Thursday morning in late February, with Marcus holding her hand and snow coming down outside the window. She was the funniest person he had ever known. She used to do impressions of their relatives that left him helpless with laughter. She made terrible puns. She kept a list on her phone of the best sunsets she'd ever seen, with locations and dates, and at the end she made him promise to keep adding to it. He came home to Toronto with Nadia, who was 2 years old and didn't yet understand what had happened. And he registered as her guardian, and he stood in the middle of his one-bedroom apartment on a Sunday afternoon with a suitcase full of a toddler's clothes and thought, okay, we figure this out. He figured it out. It took longer than he expected and cost more in every possible sense of the word, but he figured it out. He moved to a two-bedroom on the East End, which was more affordable, and he found a daycare 3 blocks away that Nadia loved, and he negotiated a schedule at work that let him be home by 6 most days. He cooked bad dinners and eventually less bad dinners. He learned which brand of apple juice she preferred, and what to do when she had nightmares and how to braid hair, which took him 4 months and about 65 YouTube tutorials. What Corinna didn't know, what most people from that part of his life didn't know, was what happened at the firm in the year after he came back from Vancouver. His company had been quietly working on a proposal for a major transit corridor development across southern Ontario. Marcus had been involved in the early planning before his leave, and when he returned he found that the project had stalled, politically tangled, going nowhere. He started working on it differently, not as a company initiative, but as something he genuinely believed in. He started building relationships outside the firm, with municipal engineers, with urban planning academics, with a retired infrastructure consultant named Gerald Bryce, who'd worked on the Calgary Ring Road and had opinions about everything. He wrote a policy brief in his spare time after Nadia was in bed that circulated through the Provincial Ministry of Transportation, and then, unexpectedly, didn't stop circulating. The project moved forward. Marcus's contribution was acknowledged in ways that made his firm's leadership suddenly very interested in his career trajectory. By the time Corinna's wedding invitation arrived, Marcus was the managing director of a division he'd helped create. He had a team of 14 people. He had a corner office that he felt slightly self-conscious about. He had been profiled briefly in a trade publication that he'd only read because his mother bought a copy and mailed it to him. He also still ate cereal for dinner sometimes when Nadia requested it and he was too tired to argue, and he still drove the same slightly dented Civic he'd had for 5 years because it was paid off and got good mileage and Nadia had named it Harold, and you can't trade in a car named Harold. He spent a week deciding whether to go. He wasn't angry at Corinna. That had surprised him when he eventually took stock of it. He'd expected the anger to stay, but it had dissolved somewhere in the intervening years, replaced by something flatter. What he mostly felt was a kind of bewilderment, the same bewilderment he'd felt reading the invitation. Why send it at all? They hadn't spoken in 5 years. They had no mutual obligations, no shared property, no children together. There was no version of this invitation that read as anything other than a demonstration. Look at where I've landed. Look at what you missed. Come watch. He might have simply ignored it. That was probably the wiser thing. But then Nadia found the invitation on the coffee table. Because Nadia found everything, it was a gift she had, and read the front of the card with great seriousness, moving her lips slightly the way she did when something was unfamiliar, and looked up and said, "Are we going to a wedding, Dad?" And he looked at his daughter, 6 years old, with her aunt's jaw and her father's eyes and a banana in her hand, and something shifted in his chest. He was done being the version of himself that other people had decided he was. He was done being the man who'd struggled, who'd been quietly set aside, who'd been deemed insufficient. Not because he needed to prove anything to Corinna, but because he wanted Nadia to see, to understand at whatever level a 6-year-old can understand, that her father was exactly who he was supposed to be. He RSVP'd yes. He called Darren Whitby, an old friend from university who now ran a private security consulting firm in Mississauga, partly because they genuinely needed to catch up, and partly because Marcus wanted a quiet conversation about something. "You want a security detail," Darren said. Not a question, halfway through his second coffee. "I want a couple of people to come with me to an event." "Why?" "It's a long story." Darren looked at him for a moment. "Is this about a woman?" "It's complicated." "It's always complicated." Darren set down his cup. "Yeah, all right, I've got 2 guys who'd be perfect. Very calm, very professional. They'll blend in." "They don't need to blend in," Marcus said. Darren raised an eyebrow and then smiled slowly, the way he used to smile before they walked into a difficult meeting in their 20s, smile that meant he understood everything without being told. "Okay," he said. Different brief. The wedding was held at Glenview Estate, a venue in Caledon with white fences and old maple trees, and the kind of sprawling stone manor that looked like it had opinions as about people who didn't belong there. Marcus had driven past it once years ago on the way to a site visit and thought it looked expensive in a way that wasn't quite about beauty. He arrived in a black SUV that Darren had insisted on, because if you were going to do a thing, you might as well do it properly. He wore a dark suit, charcoal gray, the kind his firm's communications team had helped him select when he started doing media appearances. He had a white pocket square. His shoes were polished. Nadia sat beside him in the back seat in a pale blue dress that had taken them 45 minutes to agree on. Her hair done in 2 neat braids that Marcus had attempted, and then his neighbor Mrs. Park had finished because Mrs. Park had 4 grandchildren and had taken pity on him. "Are there going to be other kids?" Nadia asked. "I don't know," Marcus said honestly. "If there aren't, that's okay. I'll just talk to grown-ups." She said this with the confidence of someone who had never found a room particularly difficult to be in, which was one of many ways she was already more socially capable than her father. The 2 men from Darren's firm, Kevin and Rob, both quiet and broad-shouldered and unhurried about everything, were waiting when the SUV pulled up. They fell in on either side without theatrics. They were the kind of people who knew how to be present without being obvious about it, and Marcus appreciated that. What happened next was not something Marcus had scripted or imagined. He had been prepared for awkwardness. He had been prepared for Corinna's tight smile and Preston's handshake and whatever the private logic of invited to shame required from both sides. He was not quite prepared for the silence that moved through the arriving guests as he walked from the SUV toward the estate entrance. The silence, and then the murmur that followed it. He saw faces he recognized. Corinna's university friends, her older cousin who'd never much liked Marcus, a colleague from his years at the firm who now worked somewhere else. He saw specifically Corinna's mother, Patricia, a woman who had once told Corinna within Marcus's earshot that he was perfectly nice, but perhaps not quite the trajectory she'd been hoping for. Stop mid-sentence and stare. He kept walking. Nadia had his hand. Kevin and Rob walked 2 paces behind. Corinna was standing near the entrance to the reception tent with a cluster of bridesmaids when she saw him. The expression that crossed her face was not something Marcus could easily categorize. It was not the triumph she had perhaps anticipated. It moved through surprise and then something more complicated, a kind of recalculation happening in real time that she couldn't fully conceal. "Marcus," she said. She had recovered quickly. She was good at that. "You came?" "You sent an invitation," Marcus said pleasantly. It seemed rude not to. Her eyes moved to Nadia, then to Kevin and Rob behind him, then back to Marcus. She stopped herself. "Is this your daughter?" "This is Nadia," Marcus said. "She wanted to come." Nadia, with absolutely no awareness of any subtext, looked up at Corinna's with frank appraisal and said, "Your dress is really pretty." Something moved across Corinna's face that might have been genuine. "Thank you, sweetheart," she said, and her voice was softer for a moment than it had been. Then she looked at Marcus again, and the calculation was back. "You look well. I am well," Marcus said. "Congratulations on your wedding. I hope it's everything you wanted." He meant it. That was the thing, standing there in the afternoon light with maple trees overhead and his daughter's hand in his. He genuinely meant it. He was not there to cause pain. He was not there to take anything back. He was there because he had received an invitation designed to diminish him, and he had decided quietly that diminishment was no longer something he was available for. He found their table and settled in. Nadia made friends with the florist's assistant, a teenager named Bridget who had run out of things to do and was grateful for the company. Kevin and Rob stationed themselves near the perimeter. Marcus accepted a glass of sparkling water and watched the afternoon light move through the maple leaves. He heard it first as a low conversation at the table nearest to him, the kind of thing meant to be private but wasn't. Corinna's cousin, the one who'd never liked Marcus, was talking to a woman Marcus didn't recognize. "I heard the firm he's running now is the one that did the transit corridor study. The provincial one." A pause. "That was him?" "Apparently," the other woman said. "But I thought he was nobody." I thought Corinna said. "People were wrong about a lot of things." A longer pause. "Preston's not going to love this." Preston, it turned out, was not having a good afternoon for entirely separate reasons that had nothing to do with Marcus. This Marcus pieced together gradually, from fragments of overheard conversation and the increasingly tight expression on the faces of 2 men in dark suits. Not his men, different men, with the specific posture of people who were there in an official rather than social capacity. He had recognized them when they arrived, because he'd spent enough time around infrastructure projects to have sat across from that particular type of official in enough boardrooms. He knew what federal investigators looked like. He had, in fact, cooperated with one branch of a financial review panel the previous spring regarding a separate matter that had touched tangentially on his division's work. What he learned later, what became public in the weeks that followed, was that Preston Vane's father's development company had been under investigation for contract irregularities across 3 provinces for the better part of 18 months. Preston had been aware. Preston had, in fact, been actively involved in several of the arrangements under review. What happened at the wedding? Federal investigators arriving mid-reception to deliver documentation and request Preston's voluntary attendance at a follow-up interview was not dramatic in the way films imagine these things. It was quiet. It was procedural. Preston went without a scene because that was the kind of man he was. Composed under pressure, good at surfaces. But the wedding ended early. The speeches were never given. The cake was cut hastily by a caterer who had a schedule to keep. Marcus stayed until it was clear that Nadia had eaten her fill of the butter tarts from the dessert table and was beginning to flag with tiredness. He said goodnight to nobody in particular. Kevin and Rob walked them out. In the SUV on the way back to the city, Nadia leaned her head against his arm and was quiet for a few minutes, which was unusual. "Dad," she said eventually. "Yeah, was that lady somebody important to you?" "Before?" Marcus considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. Outside the window, Caledon's dark fields were giving way to the first orange rings of the city's light on the horizon. The highway was quiet. Harold the Civic was back in their building's parking garage, and Marcus found himself looking forward to it. "She was," he said, "for a while." Nadia thought about this. "Are you sad?" "No," Marcus said, and found it was true. "I'm actually pretty good." Nadia accepted this and pulled her seatbelt tighter and closed her eyes. Her braids had come slightly undone on one side, which meant Marcus would need to call Mrs. Park again in the morning or practice more, and he was leaning toward practicing more. He had gotten better at difficult things by doing them. That was what the last 5 years had taught him. Not that he was exceptional, not that he'd won something, but that persistence in the direction of what matters is its own kind of quiet power. He had gone to an event designed to make him feel small, and he had stood in it, simply, as himself. His daughter had eaten butter tarts and made friends with a teenager and said that a stranger's dress was pretty. 2 federal investigators had arrived for reasons that had nothing to do with Marcus and everything to do with choices other people had made a long time ago. He hadn't planned any of that. Some things you don't plan. You just show up as exactly what you are and let the room adjust around you. The following Monday, back at his desk, Marcus added an entry to the list on his phone. Claire's list, the one she'd kept of the best sunsets she'd ever seen. He had kept his promise. He'd been adding to it for 4 years, small moments that deserved to be recorded. Saturday evening's entry wasn't a sunset. He typed it anyway. Caledon, October. Maples. Nadia asleep in the back on the way home. Pretty good. He set the phone face down on his desk and got back to work.